Mark Henderson was a 35-year-old successful entrepreneur whose name was well known in the tech world. His software development company had earned him millions and secured his status as one of New York's most influential businessmen. He was seated at a cafe table in Manhattan, one hand propping up his chin, the other lazily stirring his coffee with a spoon. Across from him, Emily, his new girlfriend, was speaking with genuine enthusiasm. Her long chestnut hair flowed over her shoulders, and her eyes sparkled with inspiration as she shared ideas for her new project. She wore a simple yet elegant dress that reflected her refined taste. "This is such an opportunity, Mark. If I can sign a contract with this gallery, my collection could get noticed outside of New York. You know how much I've dreamed of this," she said with a wide smile. Mark nodded, but his gaze wandered around the cafe. Emily continued speaking, oblivious to his lack of engagement in the conversation. Her voice flowed like a melody, but Mark barely registered the words. He had long realized that Emily was a wonderful person, genuine, kind, and caring. She loved him sincerely, her eyes lighting up every time she looked at him. But he didn't feel the same way she likely hoped he would. For Mark, their relationship was more of a light, pleasant distraction from a life filled with missed opportunities and regrets. Emily was his quiet harbor, but he didn't let himself grow too attached, fearing he couldn't give her what she deserved. "And I thought maybe you could come to the opening? Your support would mean so much to me," Emily concluded, leaning toward him across the table. Mark smiled faintly, not fully processing what she had just said. Before he could respond, his attention was captured by a figure near the entrance, and the world seemed to freeze. Catherine. She stood there, by the cafe doors, her gaze sweeping the room in search of a free table. Her blonde hair was tied back in a casual bun, and her face appeared focused and distant until she spotted him. Enough time had passed for Mark to believe he'd never see her again. Yet there she was. And she wasn't alone. Her rounded belly under a light coat immediately caught his eye. The sight hit him harder than any argument they had ever had. His ex-wife, Catherine, was pregnant. And it could mean only one thing: her life had moved on without him. Mark stared at her, stunned, as she froze, noticing his gaze. For a split second, Catherine looked like she wanted to turn and walk away, but then she slowly made her way to their table. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked gently, her voice filled with concern as she touched his hand. She had noticed the change in his expression. Mark quickly pulled his hand away as if her touch had burned him. "Yeah, everything's fine," he muttered quickly, not looking at her. His attention was fixed on Catherine approaching their table. Emily grew wary, her gaze flickering between Mark and the woman now standing beside them. "Hello, Mark," Catherine said softly. Her voice was quiet but firm, like a taut string. Her gaze briefly swept over Emily before settling on Mark. "I didn't expect to see you here." Mark slowly stood up, feeling his throat tighten with the flood of thoughts he couldn't put into words. "Who's this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This is," Mark began but faltered. His eyes met Catherine's, and he suddenly felt like a stranger in his own life. "This is Catherine. My ex-wife." Emily froze. Her face paled, but she kept looking at Catherine, trying to make sense of the situation. Catherine adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and straightened up. Her posture was calm, but her eyes betrayed unease. "I don't want to interrupt. I just couldn't not say hello," she said dryly. Mark tried to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. Catherine cast a quick glance at Emily, her lips curling into a faint, almost mocking smile. She seemed composed, but Mark knew her too well not to notice the tension in her eyes. "You look well, Mark," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I see things are going great for you." "Catherine," he started but hesitated, the words caught in his throat. Flashes of memories flooded his mind, their first meeting, laughter, arguments, the pain of losing her. Everything they had shared came rushing back as if it had all happened yesterday. "How are you?" Catherine let out a dry chuckle, but her voice carried a hint of bitterness. "Well, as you can see, life moves on," she said, adjusting her bag strap with a smooth motion. "I'd say it's nice to see you, but that would be a lie." Emily, who had been silent, frowned. Her eyes darted between Mark and Catherine, as if trying to decipher the unspoken dynamic she couldn't quite grasp. "Excuse me," Emily finally said, her voice calm but restrained. "Maybe I should leave you two alone?" "No need," Mark said sharply, turning to Emily. "You don't have to go anywhere." Catherine raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Her attention shifted to the coffee cup on the table, and she briefly smiled, as if recalling something. "Still drinking coffee without sugar, I see," she said, her voice briefly warming before retreating behind a mask of cold detachment. "Catherine," Mark began again, feeling his heart sink. He didn't know what to say or how to explain. "Don't bother, Mark," she interrupted, her voice firm now. "It's all in the past. We both made choices, and now we're living with the consequences." "Have you known each other long?" Emily asked quietly, breaking the silence that hung over the table like a heavy fog. Catherine smiled faintly, her gaze shifting to Emily. "You could say we know each other better than we'd like. We were married. Not too long ago, actually." Emily froze, her face paling. She turned to Mark, as if waiting for an explanation. "I was going to tell you," Mark muttered, feeling his palms grow clammy. "Tell me?" Emily repeated, her voice trembling with more hurt than anger. "You were married? And you didn't think to mention it?" "It's in the past, Emily," Mark tried to explain, avoiding her gaze. "It doesn't matter anymore." "Doesn't matter?" Catherine scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. "Of course, Mark. Nothing in your life matters if it gets in the way of moving forward." "Enough," Mark said, suddenly feeling the tension boil over. "I'm not discussing this here and now." Catherine raised an eyebrow but stepped back, giving him half a step of space. "Don't worry, I won't interrupt your date," she said with a barely perceptible smirk. Her gaze turned cold again. "Good luck, Mark. You're clearly in the right place with the right person." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit. Mark remained standing, feeling a whirlwind of anxiety, confusion, and quiet pain he couldn't fully process. Emily stared at him, her face frozen in an expression of disbelief. "Who is she to you?" she asked, breaking the silence, but her voice sounded hollow. Mark sank back into his chair, avoiding her eyes. "It's complicated," he finally said, the weight of guilt settling over him. But whether the guilt was for Emily or Catherine, he wasn't sure. Mark couldn't focus for the rest of the evening. Catherine's reappearance had upended his world. When Emily finally said goodbye, he felt a wave of relief. But instead of going home, he wandered to the river, hoping a quiet walk would help him sort through his thoughts. The next day, he couldn't resist and sent Catherine a message. A simple, "We need to talk." He wasn't sure she would reply. But she did. Briefly, "Why?" Mark stared at the screen for a long time before typing, "Just meet me. Give me a few minutes." An hour passed before her response arrived. "Fine. Tomorrow at 4, the cafe on West Side." When Mark arrived at the appointed time, Catherine was already seated by the window. She was gazing out at the street, her expression focused but distant. As he looked at her, he noticed the way the light fell across her face, highlighting faint traces of weariness and pain. He approached, trying to appear composed. "Thanks for coming," he said, sitting across from her. "I thought long and hard about whether I should," Catherine replied, turning her head to look at him. Tension was evident in her eyes. "But I'm here. What do you want?" Mark exhaled, trying to gather his thoughts. I don't know where to start," he admitted, running his hands through his hair. "Seeing you yesterday was unexpected, and I can't stop thinking about how we ended things." Catherine remained silent, her face impassive. "Do you think it was easy for me to see you?" she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "With a new woman, a new life." "Catherine, it's not what you think," Mark began to defend himself. "Really?" she interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Then what is it? Did you just forget everything we had?" Her words struck a nerve, igniting his sense of guilt. "No, I haven't forgotten anything. I tried, but I couldn't," he said honestly. "I thought it would be better for both of us." Catherine turned away, her shoulders tensing. "You don't know what it's like to be left behind," she said, her voice trembling. "When you left, I was on the edge. I didn't think I'd get through it. And then—" she paused for a moment before continuing. "Then I found out I was pregnant." Her words hung in the air, and Mark froze. His eyes widened, and his heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe. "You're saying that—" he began, but Catherine cut him off. "It's none of your concern," she said coldly. "I can handle it on my own. You didn't want a family. You wanted freedom. Well, now you have it." "Catherine, it's not like that," Mark exclaimed, unable to hold back. I made mistakes. I admit that. But you can't just erase me from this." "I'm not erasing you, Mark," she said, her voice quiet but tense. "You erased yourself when you chose your work over us." He lowered his gaze, his hands balling into fists on the table. "You're right. I made a choice. And I regret it every day." Catherine studied him for a long moment, as if trying to discern whether he was sincere. "Words don't change anything, Mark," she said at last. "And I don't want you showing up in my life just because of guilt." "It's not guilt, Catherine," he said firmly. "It's a desire to make things right. If there's even the slightest chance, give me that chance." She fell silent, her gaze turning toward the window. Her lips pressed together, as if she were wrestling with her emotions. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But don't expect me to forgive everything." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he replied. Catherine nodded, rising from her seat. "Then let's see what you're capable of." She left, leaving him alone with a cup of cooling coffee and a flurry of thoughts already forming into plans. The next day, Mark couldn't shake thoughts of how to help Catherine. He knew words wouldn't change anything. He had to act. Her message came around noon. "I'm having trouble with the heating. The house is cold. If you want to prove yourself, deal with it." Mark immediately found a technician and insisted they visit the same day. After getting the address, he went to Catherine's house himself to ensure everything was taken care of. She met him at the door, dressed in a long cardigan and a warm scarf. Her face looked tired, but even in this state, she carried herself with calm dignity. "You actually did it?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes," Mark replied shortly, trying to sound confident. Catherine gave him a long look, as if trying to figure out his motives. "Do you think one gesture is enough to make me change my mind?" she said, her voice cold but lacking its usual sharpness. "No," he answered honestly. "But it's a start." Catherine sighed and, after a moment's hesitation, stepped aside. "Fine, come in. Let's see what you can do." Mark followed her inside. He noticed how carefully Catherine held her rounded belly, and his heart tightened. She tried to hide the motion, but he had already seen it. While the technician checked the heating system, Mark stayed in the kitchen with Catherine. The atmosphere was tense. "Why do you think you can come back into my life?" she suddenly asked, resting her chin on her hand. "Because you were right," he said after a brief pause. "I chose my career over my family. That was a mistake I don't want to repeat." Catherine studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. "Maybe it's already too late, Mark," she said quietly. He wanted to respond, but at that moment, the technician called them over to report that everything was fixed. "Thank you," Catherine said curtly, walking him to the door. At the threshold, she hesitated. "See you," she said softly before closing the door. Mark left her house with the feeling that this was more than just a goodbye. It was an opportunity. A week passed. Catherine was silent. No messages, no calls. Mark began to wonder if her "see you" had been nothing more than politeness. But one early morning, while Mark sat with his coffee, trying to focus on reading, his phone buzzed. A message from Catherine. "I need to go to the hospital for a checkup. Can't get a taxi. If you still want to help, come over." Mark didn't hesitate. He quickly typed back, "I'll be there in 20 minutes, finished his coffee, and grabbed his keys. When he arrived at her house, Catherine was already waiting on the porch. Her coat was buttoned up to the top, and her arms were crossed to keep warm. She looked tired but, as always, carried herself with dignity. "That was quick," she noted, getting into the car. "You asked," Mark replied simply, turning on the indicator. The drive was silent. Catherine stared out the window, avoiding Mark's gaze. He tried to say something several times, but stopped each time, unable to find the right words. The only time she spoke was to ask a near-formal question. "How have you been?" "Fine," he replied, sensing it was more polite curiosity than genuine interest. "Glad to hear it," she said flatly, returning her gaze to the window. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to decipher what she was feeling. At the hospital, she insisted he not accompany her. "It's just a routine checkup. I don't need a babysitter," she said, stepping out of the car. Mark sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, staring at his phone, trying not to dwell on the sting of her words. He knew Catherine was putting up walls, but understanding that didn't make it hurt any less. When she didn't return after a while, he had no choice but to leave. Later, Mark received a call. It was Emily. "Mark, I'm terrified. Something horrible has happened. Can you come over?" "Mark." Her voice was shaking. "It's a nightmare. I hit a woman on the road." "What?" he exclaimed, feeling his stomach tighten. "Are you okay?" Yes, but it was an accident. She was crossing the road, and I got distracted. I don't know what to do." Her voice broke into sobs. Mark tried to calm her down, but he was in shock himself. "Where did it happen?" he asked urgently. "Near the house on West Side. I'm waiting for the ambulance." "Mark, I can't handle this alone." Mark went pale. "West Side." It was near Catherine's house. "Who was hurt?" "Do you know her?" he asked cautiously. I don't know exactly. She's pregnant." Mark slammed on the brakes as he drove, his heart racing and his breathing erratic. "Emily, describe her," he demanded, fear creeping into his voice. "Blonde hair. Tall. In a coat." "I don't know, Mark. I'm so sorry." Mark tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and turned his car around. Within minutes, he was at the accident scene. A crowd had gathered. A police car's lights flashed, and on the sidewalk, Catherine sat clutching her stomach. Her face showed fear, but she remained composed. Mark stopped his car and rushed to her. "Catherine!" he exclaimed, dropping to his knees in front of her. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him. "Mark, what are you doing here?" she whispered. "It's you?" "She hit you?" he asked, his voice trembling. Catherine said nothing but nodded. Emily stood nearby, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Mark, I didn't know." I didn't see her," she cried, trying to step closer. "Leave, Emily," Mark said sharply, not even looking at her. "But—" "I said leave," he repeated, his voice cold and loud. Emily froze, then stepped back, sobbing. Mark turned back to Catherine. "I'll take you to the hospital. You'll be okay. I promise," he said, gently supporting her by the shoulder. "You're a millionaire, Mark." "Fix it," she murmured bitterly before closing her eyes. Mark stood in the hospital corridor, watching as the doctors wheeled Catherine into an examination room. His heart pounded, and his hands trembled. He tried to steady himself, but his fear for Catherine overpowered everything else. A few minutes later, a doctor approached, a middle-aged man with a tired face. "Will she be okay?" Mark asked before the doctor could speak. "She's stable," the doctor replied, studying Mark closely. "Bruises, a minor leg injury, but nothing critical. Most importantly, the baby is safe." Mark exhaled in relief, though the tension didn't fully leave him. "Can I see her?" "Yes, but only briefly. She needs rest." Mark entered the room. Catherine lay on the bed, her eyes closed, her face pale. She opened her eyes slightly when she heard his footsteps. "You're here." Her voice was weak but carried a note of irony. "I thought you'd stay with Emily." "Don't start," he said quietly, sitting beside her. "I had to make sure you were okay." She smirked, but her face remained tense. "You realize this is all your fault," she said. Mark frowned. "Mine. Emily. You chose her. You wanted simplicity, Mark, but she couldn't even keep her eyes on the road." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't know she was capable of this," he admitted. "But I'm here now." "And what are you going to do?" Catherine asked sharply. He hesitated for a moment before his voice turned firm. "I'm going to take care of you and the baby. I'll take responsibility for what happened." "Are you going to fix it with money?" she asked with a bitter laugh, anger flashing in her eyes. "No," he replied, looking her directly in the eyes. "I'm going to make it right. This time." Catherine stared at him for a long time, her face unreadable. "We'll see," she said finally, closing her eyes. Mark left the room, his mind swirling with guilt, fear, and determination. Emily was waiting for him in the hallway. "How is she?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Mark stopped in front of her, his face hard. "She and the baby are safe. But for you, this is just the beginning." "What do you mean?" Emily blinked, confused. "You're going to court," he said. "I can't cover for your negligence." "Mark, I didn't mean for this to happen." "It was a mistake," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "And Catherine could have died because of your mistake," he said bluntly. "You always wanted life to be easy, Emily. But now you'll have to learn to take responsibility." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone. In the parking lot, Mark stopped, gazing at the night sky. He made a vow to himself that he wouldn't back down and would do everything in his power to earn Catherine's trust again. The next day, Mark returned to the hospital. The doctor informed him that Catherine was preparing for discharge, and Mark wanted to ensure she had everything she needed to get home safely. When he entered the room, Catherine was sitting on the edge of the bed, already dressed with a bag in her hands. Her gaze was fixed on the window, but she turned when he entered. "You came?" Her voice sounded tired. "Of course," Mark said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from her. "I want to make sure you get home safely." She smirked, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, here's your chance to play the hero again." "Don't waste it." "Catherine, I'm not here to prove anything," he said. "I just want to be here." "Be here." She shook her head. "You left, Mark. You left, and now you're back because life has thrown another challenge your way." "I know I was wrong," he said firmly, trying to hold her gaze. "But that doesn't mean I can't make it right." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing every word. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said finally. "I'm not asking for instant trust," Mark replied. I'm just asking for a chance to earn it. At that moment, a nurse entered the room to assist Catherine. All right, Catherine said, standing up. If you want to help, drive me home. Mark carried her bag to the car and opened the door for her. As they drove, he glanced at her occasionally. Her hands rested protectively on her rounded belly, and her eyes were fixed on the road ahead. You realize I'm not doing this for myself, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. What do you mean? You're trying to get back into my life because of the baby, Catherine said evenly. But being a father is more than just trying to fix things. Mark nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. I know. But I don't want to repeat my mistakes. When they arrived at her house, Catherine stepped out of the car and glanced at him over her shoulder. You can come in, she said calmly. Just don't stay long. Mark followed her inside. The house looked the same as it had before, but the atmosphere felt even more tense. Do you want anything? She asked, setting her bag by the door. Just to talk, he said, taking a seat on the couch. Catherine sighed and sat across from him. Fine. Then let's get to the point. What will you do if I decide to keep you at a distance? I'll keep trying, he said honestly. Because you and our child deserve better. Sounds nice, she said with a faint, skeptical smile. But let's see if you can offer more than words. She stood, signaling the end of the conversation. See you, Mark. Mark rose but paused before leaving. See you, Catherine. Something flickered in her eyes, but she said nothing. Mark sat in his office, sifting through papers and emails related to Emily's case. After she hit Catherine, he had been forced to completely reevaluate not only their relationship but Emily herself. She was still trying to contact him, but Mark avoided her calls. To him, it was clear. This wasn't just a mistake. It was reckless disregard and irresponsibility that could have cost Catherine and their baby their lives. A few days after the accident, Emily showed up at his office unannounced. Mark, we need to talk, she said as she walked in. Her face was pale, and her voice was trembling. He looked up, suppressing his irritation. You shouldn't have come here, Emily, he said, setting his papers aside. Why not? She asked sharply, her eyes flaring with hurt. I made a mistake, but I'm not a criminal. Mark stood, his expression hardening. You hit someone, Emily. You didn't even try to explain yourself to her or offer help. Instead, you tried to hide behind me. Emily froze, stunned. I thought you'd support me, she whispered. Support you? Mark let out a bitter laugh, devoid of humor. I supported you when you avoided responsibility, when you lived as if you had no obligations. But that's over. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice quiet but tense. I've ensured the case is going to court, he said coldly. Emily furrowed her brow, not fully grasping his words. You mean you're turning me in? She asked, disbelief filling her voice. Exactly, Mark said. You need to face the consequences of your actions. You've lost your mind, she yelled. You can't do this. You loved me, Mark. Emily, I thought I loved you. But I was wrong, he said, looking her straight in the eyes. You were there when everything was easy. But as soon as things got difficult, you showed me who you really are. She clutched her chest as though his words had physically hurt her. This is all because of Catherine, isn't it? You still love her? The next day, Mark returned to the hospital. The doctor informed him that Catherine was preparing for discharge, and Mark wanted to ensure she had everything she needed to get home safely. When he entered the room, Catherine was sitting on the edge of the bed, dressed and holding a bag in her hands. Her gaze was fixed on the window, but she turned when he entered. You came? Her voice sounded tired. Of course, Mark said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from her. I want to make sure you get home safely. She smirked, but the warmth was absent. Well, here's your chance to be a hero again. Don't waste it. Catherine, I'm not here to prove anything, he said. I just want to be here. Be here. She shook her head. You left, Mark. You left, and now you're back because life has thrown another challenge your way. I know I was wrong, he said firmly, holding her gaze. But that doesn't mean I can't make it right. Catherine stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing every word. I don't know if I can trust you again, she said finally. I'm not asking for instant trust, Mark replied. I'm just asking for a chance to earn it. Emily, furious and desperate, showed up at Mark's office days later, determined to confront him. Mark, we need to talk, she demanded, storming into his office. Mark set down his papers and sighed. You shouldn't have come here, Emily. You can't do this to me. I made a mistake, but I'm not a criminal, she cried. You hit someone, Emily. A pregnant woman. And then you tried to leave the scene, Mark said coldly. I thought you loved me, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I thought so too, Mark said. But I realize now, love doesn't mean avoiding responsibility. Emily stared at him, realizing she'd lost not only his support but his trust forever. Mark ensured Catherine's case against Emily went to court. He provided legal assistance, hired top attorneys, and made sure the evidence was presented clearly. Security footage, witness testimonies, and proof of Emily's negligence. The verdict was clear. Emily was sentenced to 2 years in prison for reckless driving and attempting to flee the scene. As she was led away in handcuffs, she glared at Mark. You'll regret this, she shouted. But Mark felt no regret. It was the end of a chapter that should never have begun. Weeks after the trial, Mark focused entirely on Catherine and her well-being. He visited her daily, brought groceries, helped around the house, and even took time off work to be available. Slowly, Catherine's icy demeanor began to thaw. One evening, as he brought her dinner, she surprised him. Stay, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Mark sat down, sensing the tension in the air. Are you doing all this for the baby? She asked, looking him straight in the eyes. For you and the baby, he answered honestly. Catherine studied him, searching for any trace of insincerity. I don't know if I can believe you again, she said softly. But I see that you're trying. And I'll keep trying, Mark said. You and our child are the most important things in my life. Catherine sighed and looked away. When you left, I thought I'd never trust anyone again. But I can see you've changed. Mark leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. Give me a chance. Not for forgiveness, but for the future. Catherine held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. All right, Mark. I'll try. But I can't promise it'll be easy. I'm not looking for easy, he said with a faint smile. 3 months later, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Jacob. Mark was there in the hospital, holding her hand every step of the way. When he held his son for the first time, tears filled his eyes. This is our second chance, he whispered, looking at the baby. Catherine watched him, her expression softening for the first time in a long while. Maybe you've earned it, she said quietly.